Evelyn Erickson is a postdoctoral researcher at the Federal University of Santa Catarina. And she's an active member of several research groups, including Lógicas Brasileiras and the Philosophy of Logic and Language group, the working group on the philosophy of formal sciences, and the working group on analytic epistemology, all lives in Brazil, right? I translated it, sorry. Yep. And Evelyn completed her studies at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Norte, and her research interests lie in logic and philosophy, with a particular focus on the teaching and philosophy of logic. And the title of her talk is A Reply to Incommensurability, from Historiography to Philosophy of Logic. So Evelyn, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Teresa, and I would like to start by thanking also Maria for inviting me to submit an abstract. I'm really happy to be here. And just to say, I know very little on the history of philosophy. It's not really my area, but I've been walking towards this area from philosophy of logic to philosophy of science to more like methodology of philosophy, and then to the historiography of philosophy. So this is my narrative. And this semester I started watching an online class given by Ana Rieger, Nastasha Pugliese, and Natalia Mendes here in Brazil. And it was lovely to watch their class and learn more about the categories that the history of philosophy uses to analyze concepts and all these things, which I thought was very good. And specifically in this analogy that I'll try to talk about between philosophy of logic, philosophy of science, to the methodology of history of philosophy. So this is sort of what my talk will be about, to see that maybe the philosophy of logic, which is where my problems, my interests are, can benefit from this exchange with the tools that the history of philosophy has developed. So this is a basic outline, and I'll try to present what my general argument is. I'll start talking a little bit about epistemology of logic and what are the current problems and issues that we're facing. Talk a little bit how we have been getting into the philosophy of science to use the methodology of philosophy of science to talk about what logic is about. And then I will say a little bit of what I have learned, or what my takeaway has been from this short period that I've been paying attention to the methodology of history of philosophy, and then go back to the epistemology of logic. So this first step here is given in terms of what maybe some people heard about, some not, but of anti-exceptionalism about logic, which is to say that logic is not very exceptional between the sciences and other areas of inquiry, and we can use the same tools of science applied to logic. A little bit of what my takeaway from the study on the history of philosophy is that there's a similarity between philosophy of science and the methodology of history of philosophy. Many of the methodological questions are sort of the same. So the inspiration of the incommensurability is where this comes from. It seems like there's a incommensurability flavor in all of these different areas that interest me. And then I would like to say, given that we can shift between the epistemology of logic to philosophy of science, and from philosophy of science to the methodology of history of philosophy, then maybe I can go back to the epistemology of logic with some baggage, and this will help me with my research question. So this little bit here is, I think, what I will try to, what I have convinced myself that works, and maybe you guys can tell me if I actually can go this far into my argument. So the usual views on the epistemology of logic are, there are three options. So the first, we think logic is a priori. So we think what Kant said, we have general conceptual schemes that we apply, and everybody share these sort of intuitions about what logic is and what reasoning does. Then we can skip a few centuries, we get to the Vienna Circle view, which is that logic is not a priori at all, it's just analytic, and we can gain logical knowledge by analyzing the forms of language and extracting meaning from this. And then we can skip a bit ahead, and then we have Quine saying that logic is empirical because all of our knowledge sits in the same web of belief. We don't have the distinction between analytic and synthetic anymore, and so we have logic is empirical. The more recent anti-exceptionalist view follows this sort of view, saying we do have empirical evidence that affects logic. I don't know how well that works, but these are the three general options that we have, and they each comes with their problems, and I don't necessarily like the way the question is framed, but these are the three general views. Then there comes the problem of there just there are too many logics. And if you think about logic as a mathematical object or logic as theories about something, what are the theories about? We have this sort of representational views on logical theories, which might not be my favorite view, but this is the mainstream. And so I need an aboutness of theories to be. So I don't know if it's about language, it's about the world, it's about the structure of thought. There are different ways we can try to frame this, but if we think logic as theories, we need them to be about something. And so there's this confusion, let's say, in the philosophy of logic to say, well, if there are many logics, which is the correct one, or which are the correct ones, or should we be logical pluralists? This is sort of there was like a wave in the 2010s-ish about pluralism, and now the trend seems to be anti-exceptionalism. And I think these are sort of the same, they are replies about the same sort of issue, which is underdetermination. What do I do if I have too many logics? And this is an issue familiar to the philosophy of science, because philosophy of science sort of knows what to do if there are competing theories about something. There are two main things which I think is worth talking about. One is what Marco Silva from the Federal University of Pernambuco talks about Quine's trap, which is to say, well, if we have different logics, we just we change meaning when we change logical vocabulary. So Quine will say the negation for the intuitionist is not the same thing as the negation for the classical logician. They're just talking past each other because they each give their own meaning to the term of negation. So he will say there is no competing meaning, just we don't even understand each other. So there's a sense of incommensurability here already, which is to say the classical logician and the intuitionistic logician, they are not talking the same language, so they do not understand each other. So the bite-sized version of this is that if you change logic, you change meaning because you're changing what the symbols represent. We also have Carnap's tolerance principle, which is to say you are at liberty to build your own logic, so you can define your logical vocabulary however way you want. And if you tell me how you did this, I will understand you. So the risk here is that there are many logics, but it's a sort of relativism, is what we usually say, which is to say, well, logic is just relative to the language you have defined. So you can have many logics and I will understand you, but it doesn't mean much. We sort of lose the aboutness of what logic is about. And so this is sort of what the philosophy of logic was at a certain point. And then there is a problem, which is that Quine and Carnap surprisingly both agree that there is no genuine disagreement in logic. We do not get enough traction in our disagreements to settle disputes. We're either talking about past each other, or we are not even in dispute over anything. So this is a bit of a anticlimactic conclusion to the philosophy of logic, because we do think that there are some genuine disagreements, and we would like to recover what this disagreement is about. So I think that there is a sense in which the disputes about many logics and how do I pick logic is has the underdetermination flavor of the philosophy of science. And there are two popular replies, which is to say pluralism. If you don't know which is the correct theory for logic, we just can get more than one and we can have pluralism. Or there is another reply, which is to say we can use an abductive argument, so inference to the best explanation, to pick the best logic, and we can settle on the determination using this method. So I think these are two popular replies, because one will say, well, just pick all of the ones that make sense. The other one will say, use extra logical principles to pick the best explanation. And this second point is what the anti-exceptionalists about logic are getting at. So use some tools from the philosophy of science to decide what logical theory. I don't really like this approach, and I think that there are better analogies of what logic is like. And so in this talk here, I will explore a little bit how logic will relate to the methodology of history of philosophy. And also, of course, there is a sense in which I don't even need to break underdetermination if I don't think there's a problem with underdetermination. So, but this is not usually, underdetermination doesn't sit well in this literature. So what is underdetermination about, and what is logical underdeterminacy? So one sense is to say there are different theories which describe something, and so I'm trying to describe the same realm of objects. And there's another sense in which, if I'm thinking logic is related to rationality or maybe normativity of reasoning and something like that, it might not be the same sort of thing as the scientific theories are about. And so we get to the point of, is logic descriptive about some phenomena, or is logic normative in relation to how people should reason on, or how things should go? And so we can get questions, is logic effective? What are logical facts? And then we can delve deep into metaphysics of logic. If you want, I will avoid that for now. But the question that really interests me is, what is logic about? Can I get an object? And I think this is the most difficult question in the philosophy of we might not even have written linguistic evidence. We have to abstract away from there. So I think the analysis is interesting to me because, like Maria said, concepts are abstract. So it seems like you guys have very good methodology to deal with abstract things. And I think whatever logic is about is very abstract. So I'm hoping here that this analogy works, and by learning more about the methodology of the history of philosophy, it can make sense to me what logic is about. One view, of course, is that logic is about cutting nature at joint. So I would have a realist view, and so I get aboutness to logic, but at the cost of this heavy metaphysics about the structure of things. There is a big problem in the philosophy of logic about evidence, because we don't know where to look for evidence, and there are many different views on where the logic might be. And I think the problem here is that whatever logical evidence is, it is invisible, it is undetectable, and it's highly theory laden. So even the way we decide to search for logical theories already ladens our understanding very much. So if I think logic is related to reasoning, I will maybe pick a set of reasoners to see how they reason, but this is already, many choices are being made along the way up to where I get some evidence of how people are arguing. And so I can say logic is in the world, is in the language, or in the structure of thought. These are popular replies. But I don't think logic can be in all of these places at the same time. That would be sort of strange. And there is a risk of saying that logic is about everyday reasoners, because we know everyday reasoners don't reason very well. So there is a difficulty of demarcating which are the set of reasoners in which I should pay attention to figure out what is the correct logic. If I say it's trained reasoners, then I'm already, it's a bit circular, because I teach a set of reasoners to reason according to my logic, and in the end they reason according to this logic, and they give me evidence to the logic I trained them on. So there is, I think we should be careful about accepting the view that we have reasoners and they will give us evidence for our logical theories. I think the story is more complicated than that. And even if we do have a favorite set of reasoners, we have to justify this, and I think in the end it would be circular. And then we go back to a recent, an old view on logic, which has recovered interest, which is logical aliens. So Frege talks about this, and I would like to thank Vivian Fairbank for presenting this talk 2 months ago in a conference in feminist philosophy of logic. I thought it was very interesting and worth thinking about. And I will not read the whole quote, but he invites us to imagine that there are beings that are found whose laws of thought directly contradict ours. And so their application often lead to opposite result than ours. The psychological logician, which is the view he wants to critique, could only accept this and say, well, for them, those laws hold, for us, these. I would say here we have here though a known kind of madness. So Frege doesn't want to allow for there to be a different set of reasoners who reason by different principles. And so I think what really interests me is to say, well, I can have different set of reasoners, and maybe I can come to understand how they reason. And so again, coming back to how the history of philosophy deals with this, there is an interesting sense in which I can look to philosophers in the past and say that they are these sort of alien thinkers, and to bridge the gap between how they thought and how they express themselves and how we express ourselves now. There is a gap, and it can be bridged. So the methodologies of the history of philosophy are particularly interesting in this sense. I don't need to look at other worlds and wait for aliens to arrive here to think about other reasoners. I can just look to the past and say, well, things have changed along the way, and I can see that they reason differently, but I can somehow recover that. And so the way that the history of philosophy has recovered the way past thinkers think is what I want to say can also help us deal with the issue of logical aliens, because maybe the philosophers of the past are the aliens that we can think about. So we have some problem of underdetermination. So I don't have even if I had a set of data, I don't know which theory to talk about. And then incommensurability is also another problem. So in philosophy of science, we say that there are different paradigms, if I want to accept this basic view, and I have different theoretical vocabulary to be used in a certain practice, and my practice doesn't agree with somebody else's practice, and so we cannot talk to each other. I don't know if there's the word in English for incognoscible, but I think in Spanish there is, and in Portuguese too. So it's something that is not cognizable. I cannot get to know. It's like the quine view. I do not understand what other people are talking about. And so I think in a sense, logic also follows in this problem. And in science, there is a solution, which is to recognize that science is a practice that happens over time. So my favorite replies to the incommensurability problem is to say, well, I do not have practice. Scientific practice does not happen in a vacuum. They develop over time, and so the concept shifts, happens over time, and I can recover and I can see how concepts have changed over time. This works in the philosophy of science, and I think also works in the history of philosophy. And the question in the philosophy of logic would be, can there be another set of reasoners that employ different standards of rationality than our own? And if there are, could I even recognize them as reasoners? And I think the difficulty here in logic is that maybe I do not even recognize what they're doing as reasoning. So my hypothesis here is that I can stretch the analogy from philosophy of logic to the methodology of history of philosophy into logic, which is to say maybe logic will lose some of the traditional properties we attribute to logic. So maybe logic will not be objective in a strong sense. It will not be universal because I need to allow for the concept to change and the set of tools I use to reason to also change. Maybe logic will lose generality and maybe it will lose topic neutrality. So I think there are some characteristics we usually attribute to logic, which we might have to let go. But in the end, it might be worthwhile doing. So now a little bit on my takeaway from the history of philosophy. I think it's interesting that reading authors of the past has its own methodological challenges, and I think this is something worth exploring. And the key that I understood is that separation in time and space leads to conceptual separation. So not only time passes, but people reason across different places in the world, and this also impacts how the concepts change over time and develop. And then my favorite topics here. Well, one way to read philosophers of the past is to just recover whatever they were talking about and pretend that they are alive today. And this is anachronism. So I remove philosophers from their context and just reason with them today. And then there's the contextual view, which is to say I should leave philosophers in the past and try to understand what they were discussing in their own terms and understand the context in which they were discussing and do this kind of work. And from what I understand, in the past decades, there has been some dispute about how we should read philosophers of the past, but I think this dispute has mostly settled, and nowadays there is sort of a mixed view and more refined tools to deal with historic philosophers of the past. So the idea here is that I can either bring philosophers, the three options, bring philosophers from the past, go back to contextualism, or say I should resist incommensurability, and there is a way that I can understand philosophers of the past still in today's terms. So the idea here is that the meanings of concepts are not arbitrary and they are polysemic, so they can change a little bit, but they remain stable enough through time and space that it is fruitful to engage nowadays with philosophers of the past, and this is possible. So I can understand that what philosophers of the past were doing was philosophy and was about the same topic that nowadays we also study. And so a few of the problems that I identified in the historiography. So I need to have a sense of shared rationality. So maybe I have to understand the practice of philosophy and how we argue and what are the dialectics of philosophy in a way that I can recognize philosophy as philosophy. There is a problem of deciding, well, should I pay attention to what the author said or what the author said that they said and what they did? So there is a way that I have to be careful about claiming too much or too little about what the author has been doing, because the author, him or herself, might not have done what was claimed. There's a difficulty here about having access to the intentions of the author because it's unobservable. I have to extract from written text what somebody else was thinking. So this is also an interesting way to think about gaining evidence for philosophy, not just from the text, but thoughts which are some immaterial. And in the sense, maybe this also works for logic, because evidence for logic is not empirical, it's not observable, and has this, it needs to appear out of thin air, just like the way we try to find the intention of the author. And so I need to look for empirical evidence that will give me access to this unobservable, and I thought this was very interesting. There's the problem of underdetermination of interpretation. So given a corpus or a text, different people will disagree how to interpret it, and I think this is also very, very interesting. There is a understanding in the people who do history of philosophy that this happens, and still research must go on. I can discuss interpretations and allow for this disagreement, and it's also fruitful disagreement that leads to better philosophy. There is also the interest of finding material evidence. So there are things in the world that we can discover that will help the history of philosophy. I thought this was also interesting. I don't know how we could try to find logical evidence in the same way, but there are definitely empirical things nowadays that happen that affect all of the unobservable things we thought we knew about authors of the past. So there is a very interesting connection between empirical evidence and the conceptual evidence that we need, which is abstract. And it seems like you guys from the history of philosophy have sort of figured out how to do this. There's also the problem of how much context. If I put too much context, then maybe I lose philosophical interest. But if I don't put enough context, then maybe I don't understand what that author was doing or was saying. So this also has to be explained and measured somehow. And then another question that interests me is, how do we define what philosophy is, and who is a philosopher and who is not, and what enters into the canon of philosophy? This is also interesting to me because there are different ways that we can reason, different, like I can reason using different heuristics, not just deduction. And maybe the way that we have cut out what logic is to mean classical deductive reasoning is not very interesting. I can also change and stretch the concept of logic to encompass these other ways of reasoning in a way that's careful enough that we don't lose what logic is about. And then the question that I also like is there progress in philosophy? And the question also applies to logic. Do I have new logics which gives me something else that's new, and can I measure progress? I think philosophy of science has a somewhat better grasp on this notion of progress, but maybe because science has more empirical way of measuring how the progress happens. Logic would not have this, so I need to have a non-empirical measure of progress. And it seems like the history of philosophy also has conceptual progress in mind when doing research. So for a while, there was this dispute of should we appropriate authors of the past today, should we read them contextually, but it seems like this is mostly settled, and I think this is very good that the methodology of the history of philosophy has gained more self-awareness maybe of how this is done, and this leads to very interesting ways of doing philosophy. And I think this is also something that other areas of philosophy should learn from, just improving the methodology to have to talk about the same text that we have had for millennia. This is very cool. So just a few lessons from the historiography. I think there is something to be gained in the philosophy of logic about finding and creating evidence, which is something that happens. Creating also new methods to talk about the evidence that maybe I have created. There is also very interesting ways to reconcile concepts with the methods that I have used to find the evidence. And there is this notion that we do need a collective history of what the authors of the past have said. So I think the history of the philosophy of logic is usually done in a sterile way of just like logical forms and logical concepts and logical, a bit of too much mathematics, without thinking about how those tools were developed over time by people who are also engaged with the community of other philosophers discussing their own philosophical issues. I think there is a lot to be gained in the philosophy of logic by paying attention to the context of the development of all of these formal tools, but also the history of how we have decided to keep those tools and not others. I think this might be my last slide. So what do I say about the problem of the logical alien? How do I solve the problem of incommensurability of rationality? So I would like to think maybe I have to think a bit more about what kind of incommensurability it is. Is it about the theory of reason? Is it about different modes of which we can reason? And could I teach the logical alien to reason the way that I reason? But for this teaching to happen, time would have to go by, different people would have to be involved. So I think this collective temporal dimension to bridging incommensurability is something that is very important in logic as well. Is it conceptual normativity? Is it normative, or is it both? Or maybe these are not quite the correct categories in which to organize these. It's interesting to think also that incommensurability is just not across time, but also space. So the way that we move and who meets who and talks to whom is interesting. If the alien just pops out here from nowhere, I think it will be a very different interaction than if the alien sort of walks slowly and it comes here step by step by reaching where we are, shifting concepts along the way and learning along the way without just appearing here. And this is, I think, what drives methodology of research. And I think my aim here of looking to the history of philosophy of science is to maybe enrich the methodology that we are using in the philosophy of logic. But then I think maybe in the end, what we need is better categories to talk about logical incommensurability and logical evidence. Maybe evidence isn't even the right word to talk about what we need in logic to have the theories we want to have. So this is my last slide. So what does this say about other reasoners? Well, I think acknowledging other forms of reasoning does not amount to relativism or incommensurability. I think we should think more fruitfully about a third option here, which is finding, like building these bridges that we need methodologies to help us with. And then which properties of logic must go? I think this is the same sort of, what we need in logic is the same sort of thing between the discussion of the perennialism versus contextualism. Maybe both of the schools of methodology in the history of philosophy had some takeaways which were fruitful. And if we can sort of look at the methodology and learn from them, and this is sort of what we need in the philosophy of logic as well. Not just say, well, we have relativism, we have pluralism, we have incommensurability, but to say, well, maybe I can have invent something else to talk about. Yeah, so I think it's really cool the way that the historiographic develops and appropriates the methodology. We just saw the last presentation do this with computer algorithms. I thought it was really cool. So this is also something that I think is very rich from the methodology in the history of philosophy. And I think philosophy of logic could do the same, be creative about the different ways in which we try to access evidence. And if we think we have evidence, how can we work with this? And so I think in the end, this would make logic worldly without making it empirical. I don't like the claim that logic is empirical. I think it's a very loaded term, but I would definitely like to say that logic is worldly. It's related to the world and the people who are in it and our shared collective history. But I don't want to say logic is empirical. So I think the history of philosophy of the history of science, philosophy can help make logic more related to the real world without having to say it's empirical in the scientific sense. So yes, this is what I had to say, and thank you for listening. I hope you guys will tell me if this idea is a bit too off or if I'm maybe in the right track, but it's been a real joy to learn more about the methodologies and you guys use and how all of this connects to the philosophy we do nowadays. And I really enjoy all of the methodological aspects of reading the text and reading letters and should letters be used as evidence, and all of these things I think are really rich, and I'm excited about this finding evidence and creating evidence, considering very carefully what is evidence and what is not, and which is, I think, the point that logic needs a lot. So what if I can maybe get some of the questions that you guys ask into logic, I think this would be very helpful to the research I'm trying to do. So thank you.
Oh, thank you, Evelyn. That was great. Thank you very much. So now we have some time for questions, discussion. You can raise your hand. Kirsten? And then
Hi, sorry, the rain's really coming down here, so I'm not even sure if I'll be able to hear your answer properly. Hopefully you can hear my question though. this was really interesting talk. So much going on here. I think I had a question about the list of problems that you listed with historiography, and I thought it was quite a helpful list. And I think I had two things to add to your list, and I'm not sure if they're going to be helpful. I'm curious about whether they kind of will make a difference to your project or not. But so one of them is one of the problems with doing historiography, at least when you're trying to do history of philosophy, is that philosophers really love telling their own histories, and they always distort their own histories to make their own work really, really important. And so all sorts of biases can creep in. When philosophers write histories, or even when historians write histories, they also tend to copy past histories a lot, and so certain stories can become really deeply entrenched, and then you have to do a history of the history in order to figure out when all those ideas came in. The other thing that I think maybe is a problem with historiography is archival practices, which is something that you kind of I think that might be related to, I think actually both of these kind of concerns are related to your point about how, needing to define philosophy and deciding who enters the canon and things like that. But yeah, it seems like the archivists and other people responsible for creating the records and preserving the records and making those records accessible and organizing those records and things like that are also kind of doing a lot to kind of create problems for historians of philosophy. So I'm curious about whether you think there are kind of analogs for those things in this kind of problem with the incommensurability of logic that you're trying to solve.
Yeah,
thank you for the... yes, I thought we lost you. Sorry.
No, I'm here. So yes, I like the question, and one of the kinds of incommensurability that I like to think about is the notion of rationality as European Western rationality, because we have lots of written texts, and this is what philosophy has sort of been about. And if we think about different traditions which are oral and people talk, and this is how things are preserved, we do not have archives. So I think a lot has been lost of the kind of evidence that I would like there to be, just because it's not written, it's not ready for the historiographer to go and get, or the philosopher of logic. So in a way, I think all of the evidence that we have about logic is what has been written in the philosophy stuff and whatnot, but that's just because, like you said, it's what the archive practice has created and preserved. And if I want to think more broadly about other forms of reasoning, it just has not been written and has not been recorded in the same way. So maybe we need to go more into anthropology, and that's where I might find the evidence that I need. But definitely something worth keeping in mind, that just the access that we have is limited by what even we're looking for. So I don't know if that sort of touches your point, but I think my question is where is the evidence, and I should be creative about where to look. And I think the historiographers are creative about looking for evidence, and so this was very cool to learn more about. So now I'm thinking maybe what I need isn't even written, and how do I recover what's not written and what has been thought but not. So these are all questions I think the historiographer might have good guides for, mind reading other people. It's how do you access what somebody thought 3,000 years ago? You guys know how to do this, and this is sort of also what I want to get at some point.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Maria.
Yes, thank you, Evelyn. It was very interesting, and so I don't know whether I see more problems than you see, because the first issue that I had is you were talking about logic, say it as a study of rationality, but then the historical evidence that you are going to find is of two different types. So either you look at the philosophy of logic, the philosophical reflections around rationality, or you look at evidence about how rationality evolved, for instance. And so, on the one hand, the first one is mediated by the philosophical language. So you can go and see what Kant said about logic and how it related to rationality, and you can go through history of philosophy trying to relate or not relate the use of these terms, right? But on the other hand, ideally, when logicians and philosophers of logic are searching for evidence in rationality, they are saying there is a sort of cognitive phenomena that it's underneath what we call reasoning and what we call logical reasoning and so on. And so the evidential for that, it's very different. So it's not about what people had said, like the theorists of philosophy or of mathematics or of logic had said, but how we have traces of our cognitive developments and how we trace good inferences that maybe were good before and now we don't accept them. And also that makes a very deep issue for me to understand a way to overcome these different types of incommensurabilities that you were talking about, because this seems to me to be the first one, the what is the phenomenon about. And then I had the intuition that there is another one about the latedness of this phenomenon. So how it is expressed, the testimony or the evidence, historical evidence that we have, how it is expressed and what it depends upon. So, for instance, take the case in which you think rationality is about how we think. And so we are going to try to trace the evidence that we have on testimony of what was rational before and what is rational now. That is going to be dependent on the language that we use to describe psychological phenomena. So take the case of paradoxes. Paradoxes are often described of contradictions, yes, but also that there is something in the reasoning that is counterintuitive. So that's a sort of psychological phenomenon. This doesn't click for me. And so that depends on us being able to understand the language latedness of those descriptions. And then you have the psychological, but also the theoretical description that is theory laden by these theoretical elements that you're using to describe and to explain. And these are going to change through time. And also you may have theory latedness from psychology, but also from epistemology, from logic, from philosophy of mathematics. And all of this may give you very different and mutually incommensurable sets of evidence that in the end, how are you going to be able to relate? So I really enjoyed your talk, but now I'm very not optimistic at all about how historians of logic can get historical evidence in order to create a cohesive narrative of what has happened around the relation between logic and rationality, for instance. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you for the question. So yeah, in that talk, I said that there's not enough logical evidence, but I think there might be, in a sense, too much. But it's like Maria said, very fragmentary. So if I like paradoxes, this is my evidence, I'll just invent a logic for this paradox. And so I sort of have evidence and I resolve the problem and create a theory, but very specific. I do not have a theory overall of all of the evidence that I think is relevant. And so maybe what the philosopher of logic hasn't decided is what is the evidence that we want. But in a sense, if depending on the subset of this evidence that I choose, I will pick a different logic. So the underdetermination isn't necessary of evidence, but if I choose an evidence, then I have a logic. But in the end, I do not have like the one true logic, which some people are looking for. I'm not particularly looking for the one true logic. So if I had to like give my own philosophical cards, that's not what I would be looking for. But in the sense, I think I have the intuition maybe that the history of the world should have, like how the world has turned out to be, should affect the philosophy of logic we have and the logic that we do have. And I think uncovering the methodological choices that have been made to get to the logic we have now would be like basic classical logic or whatnot. It just, people have chosen things and things have developed in a certain way. And I think this is also relevant. But then this project is like more in the history of logic to see how these choice points are made, and not in the like broader history of the world, let's say. But I enjoy very much the Catarina Dutti Novaes book on the natural history of deduction. I think what I want to think about is a bit what she did there, but make logic a bit more normative and try to find more evidence in a sense of that makes sense to the practitioner of logic today. So I think the paradoxes are sort of okay, and that have been around for long enough to think about. But I also think that there are other forms of reasoning that have not gained maybe enough attention under philosophy of logic. So maybe that's because that's not logic. So I can say, but inductive thinking is not logic, and probabilistic thinking isn't logic, and all this stuff isn't logic. So I get the same problem that the history of philosophy has, which is to say what philosophy is and what logic is. And so the way to answer these questions, I think, is what I can learn about the history of philosophy, to demarcate philosophy from not philosophy, so I can demarcate logic from not logic, and this will give me evidence from the start. So if I think that some forms of reasoning are not logic, I will not even look there for my evidence. And this is like, how do you say in English? Like posts along the way that sort of mark the choices that I have made today to decide what logic is. And in the end, I think it is more interesting to extend logic from just deductive logic to other forms of reason that do encompass in a way the ordinary speaker and how people reason, which is not deductive, and it's not necessarily what the philosopher of logic is interested in describing or something like that. And it's not exactly psychology either, because there is a normative aspect, and depending on how I set up my reason and what incentives I give my reasoners, they will reason better and not. So I think these are also things which are interesting. But I think the point of the talk here was just to see if the way that the historiographer looks at the history of philosophy and finds and creates evidence and decides what's worth looking at, I think that might be fruitful, because then the philosopher of logic can say, I don't even like paradoxes. I don't even think that's something interesting and worth being evidence for deciding what logic is. And maybe I can have a principled way of demarcating that. And maybe I have to think more about the set of evidence that we already have and who agrees with what. But I think the picking evidence in a way that's not like cherry picking to say, well, I get the evidence that I want for my favorite logic, and that's just it. I think this is something that we can learn from the history of philosophy, getting evidence without having to cherry pick and being like methodologic suspicious in this sense.
Thank you, Evelyn.